to the fifth episode of the TMC Talk Show, and today we are here with Ginete, and Zhao has held many different jobs, including time at McLaren and Red Bull F1, but today we're going to take the time to talk through not just his time in Formula One, but all the other cool ways that he's been interested in the world of motorsport. Well, first, Zhao, thank you for coming on to the show.
My pleasure.
So I guess going into that first question, how did you kind of get interested in motorsport? Was it always something that you had a passion for, or did you kind of pick it up later in life?
The first time I remember watching race cars I was about 10, and I couldn't sleep, and I turned the TV on, and the Australian Grand Prix happened to be on. And then kind of after that, for a few years, I didn't really miss an F1 race. I kind of fell away from it a little bit when they stopped showing it on live TV in Portugal, which I think was about 2006. And I didn't really pay much attention to motorsports for a little while. I kept in touch, but not really super involved. And then when I went to the University of Washington in Seattle, I found out they had a team of a project called Formula Student, where essentially university students design and build a race car and then go and compete with other universities in competitions. And I got involved in that, and basically from then on I realized I wanted to work in motorsport, and then that was pretty much it. That's how I got involved in it.
So I know that in particular you studied aerodynamics, right? And that was a bit more what you did with your job, right? So was that something that you picked up with Formula SAE in Washington, or?
Yeah, well, I kind of got into motorsports through aerodynamics because I decided to do a degree in aeronautical engineering. And that was already in Bristol in the UK, where I was studying. And to be honest, the reason I chose aeronautical was because it started with an A and it was the first on the list. I had no idea what I wanted to do. And it just happened to be a nice way to get into motorsport because, as it turns out, aerodynamics is one of the most important parts of race car design. And so I was kind of lucky in that way. But yes, I used up the part of the car that I was working on was the aerodynamic package, the wings. And I realized that was more enjoyable than pretty much all of the parts of my degree, which, yeah, I was just lucky to find that, because otherwise I was probably working at, I don't know, Airbus or something, and doing something that, even though interesting, probably would not have been as enjoyable for me as motorsports.
Your first job out of college, if I'm not mistaken, was with McLaren, correct?
Yeah.
So was that something that was it a job you expected to receive, or were you just kind of totally surprised by it?
No, I was not expecting that. I applied for any F1 job that I found on the grid, from any team on the grid. Also F2 jobs at the time, or GP2 jobs. Any motorsport jobs pretty much that were open were at the time, around the time I was finishing my degree, I applied for. And yeah, I got pretty much ignored or rejected from everyone else until McLaren offered me an interview, which I was pretty amazed by. And then I did the first interview, and then they invited me to a second interview, and then they gave me a job. So I think basically what happened was they were looking for senior aerodynamicists, and they couldn't find any. Then they were looking for aerodynamicists with 3 years experience, and they couldn't find any. And so then they resorted to graduates, and I happened to be the better one, or the ones they interviewed. So it was a lot of luck there. But no, definitely not expecting to land that job.
What specifically became your role when you joined McLaren? Did you travel with the team, or were you there at Woking working in the headquarters?
No, yeah, it was. I was pretty much factory based for my whole time in F1. So I was part of the aerodynamics department, which essentially kind of works on the aerodynamic development and the design of the car. So we just sit at our desks and draw bits to go on the car. We test them in CFD, which is kind of a virtual wind tunnel to assess if they make more downforce or not. And then from then on, we go and test it in a wind tunnel, which at first was the bulk of my job, was to run the wind tunnel, because it's like shift work, and it's not the nicest part of the job, but someone has to do it, and it's usually the new kid. So when I started that, when I started at McLaren, the first 3 months, it was underground in the wind tunnel, pretty much just learning how to operate everything and write reports and etc. Which is pretty much what everyone does when they start off. And then that was in Woking, and then we started going a lot to the Toyota wind tunnel in Cologne. So then I started going there as well. But I was quite lucky quite early on to start working on car development, because my boss just threw things at me and gave me the opportunity to do it, which was very rare at the time. I mean, a lot of other colleagues that started around the same time were stuck in the wind tunnel for years before they actually got anything on the car. So again, I was quite lucky in that respect.
Like, what part of the car did you end up working on if you did get that opportunity?
The first thing that I got on the car was something that doesn't exist anymore. There was a lower beam wing under the rear wing, between the rear wing and the diffuser, that they got rid of a few years ago. So that was the first bit that I got on the car. It was pretty sure it was a repeat. There was not a lot in it, but they were nice enough to make it so that I got something on the car. But then shortly after that, I started working a lot more on the area around the rear tire, which at the time was a pretty hot area, because that's what around the time of the exhaust blown diffuser, and there was a lot of performance in that particular corner of the car because of the exhaust, and also what happened when there was no exhaust, and how you had to live with the parts of the corner where you didn't have exhaust blowing, saving you essentially. And yeah, that was probably one of the most interesting projects I had while at McLaren.
They ended up banning like those rear blown exhausts, right?
Yeah, they did it in a few stages. So the year I got there was the crazy year where like no one really paid any attention to anything else in the car. There was literally the whole department was working on exhausts, because they had the tailpipe right by the wheel, and they were just blowing hot air into the tire and sometimes burning the tire side roll. It was a bit ridiculous. And then the year after, we had these, they mandated the plates for the exhaust to exit, but then you could still put bodywork around it, and we had these ramps that kind of took the exhaust momentum and pointed it at the same place where it was the previous year. So we lost a bit of the effect, but by the end of the season, it was still pretty powerful. But then kind of the main thing that they banned from one year to the other was the engine modes that basically managed to keep the exhaust blowing even when you got off the throttle. And so we started having to work with not having exhaust blowing and try to make sure that the car becomes completely undrivable as soon as you got off the throttle. And so that was the most interesting bit for me, I'd say.
So right after your McLaren job, you decided to switch to Red Bull. So if you don't mind me asking, what kind of prompted you to make that job switch?
Things weren't going very well at McLaren, not just for the team as a whole, but also for me personally. I think every major office has a lot of politics going on, and I just got caught on the wrong side of it. And I pretty much had no other option other than to go. I did do my best to try and stay at McLaren, because I appreciated the fact that they gave me a job to start with, and I had a lot of friends there, and I was comfortable there. But even when I tried to find a solution for my situation, that wasn't even allowed, and so I basically started looking elsewhere, and I found I got an opportunity at Red Bull, and I figured out that it was a good opportunity to work for one of the other top teams to learn different ways of doing things. And obviously they had Adrian in charge, which was something else that was cool to say that I've worked for a team that was led by Adrian. So that was also nice.
Yeah, just a sidebar, because Adrian Newey he's considered one of like the greatest F1 engineers to ever, work in the sport, right? So how much of contact did you have with him? I mean, like, were you working directly with him, or did you just kind of see him around the office?
Well, the first 2 years when I was on the F1 side, I just pretty much around the office. He did sit down in meetings that we had every 3 weeks. Each team had we call them strategy meetings, and we discussed what we've been up to, and what we should do to move forward. But then on the last 2 years where I was at Red Bull, I worked quite closely with him on the Aston Martin Valkyrie, with the advanced technology side. So there, yes, it was there. I worked pretty much. It was the two of us doing that development. There was a couple of surfacers that kind of helped us drawing the big chunks of bodywork that I did not have the talent to draw in CAD. It's the kind of thing that kind of takes 5 minutes to explain what you want to do, but takes 5 days to actually draw. And so we had people who were very good at drawing that could do it a lot quicker than us. But yeah, then I got to work quite closely with him, and that was pretty cool.
Speaking more towards your time on the F1 side at Red Bull, was it kind of more of the same, like what you did in McLaren, or did your responsibilities start to change?
It was very similar. I did pretty much the same things that I did when I was at McLaren. Ran the tunnel, tried to help develop the car. I can't say it was massively different. The only thing that started to change was that I was no longer the youngest person on the team, which I was on McLaren. I think when I left, I was still the youngest because they hired a few people after me, but they all had PhDs, so they were older. Whereas at Red Bull, I think I already wasn't the youngest when I got there, and then we started getting a lot of interns. That's something that Red Bull had that was quite good that McLaren didn't have, which was a strong industrial placement program where every year we had industrial placement students joining us for a whole year, and they were very useful. They learned a lot, and then it was an entrance door for them, and it was a very extended interview for us to spot who was actually very good and who was maybe just okay. And I got given a bit of responsibility, like taking a bit of a mentorship role with them, trying to get them more involved. Also because I think other people didn't appreciate like what that means for a talented engineer to actually be given the opportunity to do something rather than just like tedious monotonic work, which is what these people are usually tasked with. So yeah, I think that's probably the only difference. And I had a couple of kids that I ended up having a really good relationship with, and I think I made the most out of them, their time at Red Bull.
Other than things like a mentorship program or internship program, did you see like some basic differences in how the team ran opposed to McLaren? Yeah,
it was night and day pretty much. You could not pick two more different departments, which is fascinating because like the quality of the work was very high in both places. There was a lot of very clever people on both teams that I was very lucky to work with. But McLaren was this super corporate place where the whole building was grey and everyone wore a shirt and a tie, and you couldn't wear jeans or sneakers at work, and where almost everyone came from either Oxford or Cambridge Uni. A few of us from Bristol, that was pretty much it. And I went to Red Bull where, we get in and you've got people wearing shorts at work. The desks at McLaren, there was no coffee at your desk policy. You couldn't have liquids at your desk, maybe a bottle of water, I think that was allowed. You were discouraged from even having pictures of your kids and stuff at your desk. I think it's a bit different now, but this was still, remember, Ron was still around at this point. And I remember the day that Ron announced his return, literally standing on a table in the cafeteria announcing that. It basically was this Michael Jordan moment, like, I'm back. That was pretty much the same with with Ron. That as soon as we got back to our desks, the people that were around when Ron was in charge the first time around started tidying up cables. You had everyone just under their desks tidying things up because they knew that as soon as Ron was in charge, then this would start to matter. And Red Bull, there was nothing like this. It was super relaxed. People came from all sorts of different backgrounds. Some people didn't even have aero degrees. They came from the race team. They were performance engineers. They were mechanically minded people that just happened to get into aerodynamics and learn on the job. And yeah, it was very, very different. But somehow the kind of the results and the competitiveness of both teams was very similar. So to me, that's really interesting.
Kind of continuing down your career path, right? After your first stint at Red Bull, you went and briefly joined Agrawal Racing, correct? And yeah. So that they competed in the European Le Mans series, right?
Yeah.
So how was working with an LMP2 car different than working with an F1 car?
Well, there was a lot different in that job from my previous job. Not only the car, but also my role. I was no longer designing anything or developing anything. I was operating a car that was already good to go. So from the outset, that was a big shock to the system. Also, endurance racing is completely different from F1 in terms of like the logistics and the strategy and everything else. So that was, again, there was a lot to take in. And I mean, I kind of fell completely like in the middle of it. Essentially, the reason I got that job was I was obviously still at Red Bull while I was doing this. And I agreed to stay at Red Bull to stay on the Valkyrie program, and I got one of the things I said was, yes, I'll do this, but I want to get a little bit more into race engineering, so I'd like you guys to let me do this and perhaps help me get a job. And they said yes, and then basically the job that showed up was Adrian's son, Harry, was racing for an LMP2 team. And they fired their engineer, so Adrian just asked me, do you want to come and do it? And I was like, okay. And I literally arrived, and the day before the first test, they gave me the manual of the car to read, and I'm like, what? Could you not have sent me this last week? It would have been nice to have a little bit more of a heads up. But it was a lot to take in, but on the first race, we probably could have finished on the podium if we hadn't had a couple of things going away from us. And but answering your question a bit more directly, it's in terms of setup, it's a heavier car, slightly, I'd say. You've got fewer setup items that you can play with. Because everything's homologated, so there's not a lot that you can do. But also the main thing is you're working with 3 drivers, and you have to set the car up so that 3 drivers are happy, and that is not easy. The amount of times I had drivers cornering me, telling me you have to do this, otherwise I know this other guy wants something else, but I need this. So and at the end of the day, you can only say, look, I'm trying to get the best result out of all 3 of you. So it's not going to be perfect for any of you, and you're just going to have to live with it. So this is, and that's quite difficult. And also the whole thing about who qualifies is always a very awkward conversation, because you're having meetings about data, and these meetings are pretty much the drivers all arguing with each other. Look, I'm quicker there. No, I'm quicker there, and I should qualify and whatever. And sometimes I had to get up and leave because I had better things to do than listening to drivers arguing with each other.
As you were saying before, you continued to work at Red Bull, right? But instead you were doing the Aston Martin Valkyrie project.
Yeah.
So can you just walk us through that a little bit, like why the Red Bull team was involved in that, and what your level of personal involvement was on that project?
Well, the story behind the project is essentially, Adrian wanted to do a road car. He made no secret of it. A little bit like Gordon Murray had done with the McLaren F1. He decided he wanted to do a road car, and obviously Red Bull wanting to keep him, try to figure out a way of making that happen. So they created this advanced technologies group, which is a little bit inspired by the McLaren advanced technologies. Sorry, McLaren Applied Technologies group, which basically intended to take the technology that they had for F1 and apply it to the projects. And I think one of the first projects was working with the Ben Aisley racing team in America's Cup. And that didn't last very long. And then the next one was to do a road car. And so they started working on this road car, and then eventually Aston Martin came on board, and then the Valkyrie was born. And then essentially the way I come into this is Adrian was dedicating most of his time to the Valkyrie at one point. Not most of it, but a large portion of his time to the Valkyrie. And this was before the 2017 season, while I was still in F1. And then in 2017, I handed in my notice because I decided that I had enough of living in the UK, F1, I wanted to take a break. So basically the plan was I was going to leave and go traveling for a year and then figure out what I wanted to do next. But obviously I had 6 months notice. And so I handed in my notice in February, like everyone else, because I wanted to get my bonus paid, because that happens on the 31st of January. So on the 1st of February, I handed in my notice, and I got put on gardening leave, in a room, basically just waiting to serve my 6 months notice. And it happened that the car at the time, RB13, went to preseason testing and wasn't very competitive. And so Adrian essentially was drafted back in to get full attention onto the F1 car, and so couldn't give that much input into the Valkyrie. And at the time, there was pretty much almost no one else doing aero development for it. There were some people helping out, but no one properly focused on it. And I was in the room doing nothing, so they just asked me to essentially what Adrian asked me at first, was just have a look at the front wing. And I think 6 months later, we had redrawn most of the car, with Adrian, obviously, but it was more, we draw something, have a 10-minute conversation with him about what we did, what he thought we should do next, and then we'd go out and do that. And so instead of him actually drawing things on his drawing board, which was happening until then, his input became a little bit more through us. And so, yeah, and then after those 6 months, I enjoyed working on the project, and I think that everyone else enjoyed working with me, so they asked me to stay, and I'd say I couldn't really say no to Adrian, so I did that. Then I stayed for another couple of years, and we pretty much finished the road car, which is currently being kind of prototype tested. I'm not sure how long that's going to last. Hopefully not too long, because it's already meant to be delivered in 2020, but I'm not sure that's going to happen. But I just hope that one day we'll see it on the roads, because it's a pretty incredible car. And then we started working on the second version that was announced, the AMR Pro version, which is meant to be just a track car. And that was probably the most enjoyable part of it, because it's something that we started from scratch. I started from beginning to end, but sadly the end came when we realized that the project just wasn't viable from a financial standpoint. And the project pretty much as we intended it to be, which is it was going to be a car that was faster than an F1 car, the fastest car that ever went around the racetrack ever. Yeah, I don't think that's ever going to happen, but it was a very enjoyable project to work on, as you can imagine.
So then after that, did you take that 1 year gap before going to Moto Park, or was that after?
No, so I ended up just traveling for 3 months, which was still pretty good fun, I'm not going to lie. But the Moto Park thing happened while I was still at Red Bull. So essentially after Algarve, I wanted to keep race engineering, and I was looking around and couldn't find anything. And then a colleague of mine asked me if I wanted to go to Japan and engineer a car, and I said sure. And I think 5 days later, I was on a plane, and then I was in Suzuka to do some preseason testing, and so that year 2019, last year, I was flying back and forth to Japan while working full time at Red Bull. And so that was pretty brutal, but also pretty fun. And then I ended up doing some races here in Europe as well with MotorSport. So it was pretty full on.
Yeah, so when you were in Japan, right, that's where you actually met Anam, correct?
Yes, yeah. It was, I was working on the Japanese F3 side of the operation with two drivers. First with a Japanese gentleman driver called Tairoku Yamaguchi. And then he kind of decided to step aside halfway through the season, and then I moved over to a guy called Ameya by Ginete to take care of him for the rest of the season. And Inam was one of our other drivers, and he's quite the character. So we had some fun together.
Yeah. So for any of our audience who doesn't know, Inam Ahmed was the first guest that I had on my show. So, like, just out of curiosity, you said that he was a character. So, like, what was it like to work with him or work on the same team as him?
It was always good fun because he's always joking around, and it's always entertaining to have him in the same room. It's always good banter, and he's obviously shown different parts of his career that it can be very, very quick. And hopefully he'll manage to find that mojo back in FIF3 this year. But it was great fun, and it definitely made the whole thing more relaxed, because as you can imagine, the Japanese side of things was always tricky because the communication barrier, the language barrier was very, very, very strong. And also the motorpark side of things, they're quite strict and very German in many ways. And so it was good. He was a little bit of a breath of fresh air. But yeah, it was nice. It was good.
Moving on to like current day, what you're doing right now. So you currently work for two teams, Hota Sport and Von Amersfoort, correct?
Yep.
So like most of your career, you've kind of been juggling two jobs at once. So like, has that always been like a difficult thing, or have you kind of learned to deal with it?
I'd say I probably do it by choice. I think I'd probably get bored if I just do one thing. To be honest, the reason I decided to leave Red Bull was so I could. I decided to give it a go as a freelancer, as a contractor, so I could kind of do different things and not have to choose between kind of designing cars and racing cars. And so I actually have more than those two jobs. I'm also working on a car here in Portugal that we're putting together, trying to create a G3 car, which has been really good fun. But then on the racing side of things, it's first of all, it's pretty much there's a bit of work in between events for both these teams, but most of the work that is actually during the races, and so that gives me a lot of free time, to be honest. And so it's not that frantic. I mean, when racing, it is pretty intense, but it gives me a lot of free time in between. And obviously, this season is going to be a bit different because obviously we're meant to be racing in March, and we're not going to actually get going until August, which then means August, September, October are going to be insane. I think in the August and September, I have 2 weekends off in total. And yeah, I don't know how that's going to go. I think I have an EFO race and then Le Mans and then another EFO race and then another EFO race the weekend after. I think after that, I'll need to sleep for about 3 days straight.
Yeah, I mean, that just I can kind of understand why you would maybe want to be like a freelancer, because I actually read Adrian Newey's book, and he talks about how he was always, especially at the beginning of his career, he was always flying back and forth between London and the U.S. because he had IndyCar things. So that definitely seems like I guess like a better way to just work on your own terms at least.
Yeah, and it's a good point that you make. It's like motorsport has changed so much that it's almost impossible to do what Adrian did, kind of at the beginning of his career, where he spent half of the time designing cars and the other time actually racing them. You can't do that anymore. That just doesn't happen. F1 has become so specialized that you have to choose between one and the other. And even if I wanted to choose halfway, into my F1 career that I wanted to be a race engineer, I pretty much have to start from scratch. And that's another 10, 15 years to get to that position. I actually had a colleague who went the other way around. He was Mark Webber's and then Daniel Ricciardo's performance engineer, and then decided I'm going to give aerodynamics a go. And so he started from scratch in aerodynamics and built his way back up. But then he got so frustrated with having to work kind of from that level that he ended up leaving and going to IndyCar, and he's New Garden's race engineer now, just won the championship last year. So it is very frustrating to be in F1. Besides all the other political problems that I mentioned earlier, it's such a crowded business and very specialized that this freelancing idea was mostly so I could learn more about different aspects of car engineering and car development and etc. and be able to do the jobs that I want to do. And for instance, the two racing jobs that I currently have, that similar but completely different. Like the F3 job is about working with the driver, obviously, to develop the setup of the car to be as fast as possible, but also to suit his driving style, but also work on his driving style to make the most of the car and the tire. And there's very little strategy involved. These races are pretty much, push all the way through because they last half an hour, not even that. And qualifying is the most important part. You have to deliver kind of the lap on the peak of the tire. And that's very challenging because it's a lot about human psychology and a lot about trying to get your message through to the driver and try to get him motivated and try to get him the confidence in himself and in the car to push where he should. And it's something that I'm learning a lot about that I have no idea about because I never drove. I was never a racing driver. A lot of the race engineers at this level they were racing at some point in their career, and that's how they've learned this. And so I'm kind of learning everything as I go along. Actually, the car setup bit is the one that I'm most at ease with because I understand it a lot better than the other side of it. And on the other side of things, it's obviously the car setup and even the driver coaching at that level. There's not a lot of driver coaching because you have pretty good drivers on board. And even though you have an amateur, which in our case is a pretty good amateur, you have two professional drivers like I have Anthony Davidson and Antonio Felix da Costa, who are one XF1 driver, one XF1 test driver. They know what they're doing and they can perfectly coach the other driver if need be. I'm not very useful in that sense, but then I'm learning a lot about race strategy to the point where I can hopefully soon contribute to the decisions that are made during the race, which somewhere like Le Mans in the last 24 hours, you get them 2 or 3 of these right and suddenly you can be in contention and get 2 or 3 of these wrong and you're 3 laps down. So I'm learning a lot about a whole lot of different things, and that was kind of the intention, and I'm pretty happy with that decision.
Would you say that this type of freelance engineering is something that's common, or are you kind of like the only person that you know about that's doing this?
No, it's definitely common. It's definitely common to have freelancers doing different jobs at the same time. What's possibly a bit different about what I'm trying to do is that I'm doing very different series. So it's more common that a freelancer will stay either just in sports car racing or just in the junior formulas. Or just in aerodynamics, and I'm trying to do the three at the same time. And if there are more projects coming along and I can fit them in, I'll try and do that as well. So, I mean, maybe there are. I'm pretty sure there are other people out there doing that, but that I know of, that usually stick to a certain kind of knowledge field, whereas I'm trying to do as many different things as possible, trying and learn as much as possible. And also, there's always kind of flux of information between the different areas. There's things I learned in the F3 car that then could be interesting to try on the MP2 car, and there's definitely a lot I know from the aerodynamic side of things that is helpful to operate these other cars. So it's definitely one of my targets, and always has been, to be as complete an engineer as I can be. And I think that this is probably the easiest way nowadays to achieve it. It's almost like I'm trying to do what engineers did in the 60s now, and this is the only way.
Well, my last question for you is, taking your career in stock so far, right? You've worked with F1 cars, F3 cars, F4 cars, LMP2 cars. You built a road car with Aston Martin and Red Bull, and I'm sure you're going to go on to do more things, as you already are now. So what's kind of been like that favorite job or favorite car project that you've done so far in your career?
I'd say that the most enjoyable project I worked on was that what we call 002, so the second version of the Valkyrie, that I kind of touched on earlier. As it was from the outset, it was build a car with no compromise. And that was already, a very enticing thing. And then we basically started with a bunch of drawings from Adrian, and they were already, obviously very good base, because they already had the 001 development, the Valkyrie development as a good base. And then his drawings obviously took that to the next level. And then from then on, we set ourselves a target. And pretty much, and I think it was a 6-month development cycle. And after 1 month, we'd beaten the target. And then after the other 4 months, we just kept going up and up. And at one point, this car was going to be absurdly fast. And, you'd see it in the simulator and the lap times he was doing. And driving our little PlayStation type simulator that was just used to kind of debug the models and everything else, I was lapping faster than Lewis Hamilton that year around Silverstone, which, I was doing that. So imagine what a proper driver would have done. It was just the amount of downforce that car had was absurd. And also, it was good to be able to build a small team that sometimes was quite big, because we always got the people that were like I was before on their way out of F1. So we got them for 6 months, and at one point I had 8 people on my team, and obviously all F1 people who were very switched on and also very interested in working on something rather than being in a room with nothing to do, which is the usual in their situation. And yeah, the development rate was absurd, and it was really good fun. And so I'd say that was the most interesting. And also I got to work with a lot of very clever people also on the vehicle dynamics side, simulation side. Learned a lot about that side of things. That also helps me nowadays. Also prepare me to do projects like the one I'm working on here in Portugal at the moment. That's also been very enjoyable, but I've kind of been a little bit on my own. It's just been me working on it. And it's not as much fun as if you have a team of people that you can kind of work with, bounce ideas off with, get excited about things with. So obviously there are other people working on different parts of the car, but on the aerodynamic side, it's just been me. And so I'd say, yeah, the 002 Valkyrie is the car that I've enjoyed working the most on, which tells you a lot because it's a car that's never going to exist. So it's quite sad, but it's true.
All right. Well, thank you for coming on the show. It's been a lot of fun talking with you, getting to know about McLaren, Aston Martin, and all the other second jobs you've held, and I've thoroughly enjoyed it.
All right, me too. It was good fun.
Yeah.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you.